The evening started with a small catastrophe at the company's charity dinner in the hotel. It began innocently enough. Someone knocked over a table laden with champagne glasses, sending them all crashing together in a cacophony of shattering crystal. The noise was deafening and the spectacle was even worse. Glasses, champagne, napkins, everything tangled in a heap on the floor. The room fell silent, frozen in place. I felt my heart race as I stood there in the center of the hall, not quite sure how to react. The guests stared in stunned surprise, unsure of what to do, their faces a mix of confusion and embarrassment. A few awkward chuckles echoed from the back of the room, but no one moved to help. I stood motionless for a moment, trying to assess the damage, and then, as if on cue, I thought to myself, well, this is the perfect start to a party. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. I wondered if they were waiting for me to make the first move, to salvage some dignity from the mess. But I didn't know how. I wasn't sure I had it in me to do anything other than stand there and let the awkwardness settle around me like a thick fog. And then, just as I was about to give in to the uncomfortable silence, I heard a voice from behind me. "Looks like we've had a little spill here." I turned, expecting to see someone from the staff, but it wasn't one of the servers. It was Jackson, my boss. He was strolling in like nothing had happened, his face impassive, his dark suit somehow untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded. Jackson didn't seem bothered by the scene at all. In fact, he looked almost amused. He approached the mess with a slight smirk and bent down to survey the broken glasses. "Well, looks like someone needs to save the evening," he remarked with a hint of irony, before picking up one of the remaining unbroken glasses and handing it to me. His hand brushed mine as I took the glass. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but I felt a strange warmth spread through me. I was still standing there, completely stunned by the sudden calm he exuded in the midst of the storm. His gaze met mine for a fleeting moment, and for a split second, something shifted in the air between us. A spark. Something unspoken. Jackson straightened up, his sharp suit still immaculate, not a crease out of place. He looked around the room with an air of someone who had been through worse. There was no panic, no discomfort in his demeanor, just a calm certainty that seemed to anchor the chaos around us. "Well," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the tension, "I think we've all learned something tonight. Don't place tables too close to the edge." His tone was dry, and yet there was something about it that managed to put the room at ease. It wasn't a command, but more of an observation, as though he was gently reminding everyone that it wasn't the end of the world. "Let's not let this ruin the night," he added, offering a slight, self-assured smile as if to reassure the room that things would somehow be fine. The guests, who had been frozen in place, suddenly came to life again. Some of them chuckled nervously, others began picking up the shards of glass, and soon the atmosphere started to return to its usual buzz. But it was a different kind of buzz now, a little more aware, a little more tentative. They were all watching Jackson, taking their cues from him. It was clear that whatever happened next, Jackson would steer the evening in the right direction. I stood still, watching him. There was something magnetic about him, something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was his natural authority, or the way he never seemed flustered. He was the kind of leader who didn't need to shout or demand attention. It came to him naturally. He didn't need to impose his will on others. His very presence made people follow. Then he turned to me, that same smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Well, I suppose you're in charge now, aren't you?" he said, his voice lighter than before. I blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by the shift in tone. "In charge?" I stammered, barely able to form a coherent thought. I had only been with the company for a year, and while I did my job well, I had never been the center of attention like this. "Of course," Jackson continued, still maintaining that calm, measured air, "you were the first to respond. You stayed steady when everyone else was, well, somewhat surprised." His eyes lingered on mine for a moment, and I could feel a slight pressure in the air, like a challenge, one that made me squirm with both discomfort and an unexpected thrill. I stood there for a few moments longer, still holding the glass he had handed me. His words echoed in my mind. "You were the first to respond." What did that mean? Was I really the one taking charge here, or was it just a fluke, a simple reflex to try to fix the chaos? I stood there, the glass still in my hand, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. My pulse had quickened ever so slightly, not just from the incident but from the way Jackson had looked at me, like there was something more than just a casual conversation going on beneath the surface. But I tried to ignore it, taking a sip of the champagne as though the delicate bubbles might wash away my discomfort. The room had started to settle into its usual rhythm again. Laughter echoed from one corner, people were chatting more freely, and the music had started playing again. But it didn't feel the same. It wasn't just the accident. It was the strange, unexpected exchange I had with Jackson, the way he had looked at me, the way his hand had brushed against mine when he handed me the glass. But I didn't have time to dwell on it because, at that moment, Jackson was back. He was making his way through the crowd again, this time with purpose. I caught a glimpse of him as he approached, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on me. "Let's make sure we don't lose the moment, shall we?" His words were soft, but they cut through the buzz of conversation around us. He reached for his own glass, a gentle clink as it met mine, and for a brief second, I felt like the world around us had quieted. We stood there, side by side, the small space between us suddenly charged with something unspoken. His eyes met mine again, steadier this time, more intense, and I felt a strange warmth flood through me, from my chest to my fingertips. I wasn't sure how to react. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to focus on the glass in my hand, trying to make sense of the knot tightening in my stomach. But there was no escaping the fact that the touch felt different. It wasn't just a friendly gesture, nor was it purely professional. It was something else entirely, a whisper of something that felt personal, too personal. "To a successful evening despite the minor interruptions," he said, his smile returning. But this time, there was something softer, something warmer about it. I tried to match his smile, though I was sure it didn't reach my eyes. My mind was still spinning, and the moment felt fragile, like it could either snap into something meaningful or evaporate entirely. And just as quickly as it had all begun, he moved away again, seamlessly blending back into the crowd, leaving me to stand there, holding my glass, completely off balance. The room resumed its chaos, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that this wasn't just another fleeting moment. No, this was something more. And now, as I stood there, trying to steady my breath, I wondered if I was ready for whatever was about to unfold. The evening unfolded around me as if the chaos from earlier had never happened. The guests laughed, mingled, and sipped their drinks, slipping back into the comfortable rhythm of the event. But I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. My pulse hadn't quite returned to normal, and the memory of Jackson's touch lingered like a faint echo of something unspoken, something that had shifted between us. I scanned the room absently, hoping that the distraction of the crowd would help me shake off the unnerving sense of awareness that I now felt. But every time I looked around, my eyes seemed to find him, always in the distance, always just out of reach. It wasn't as if Jackson was staring directly at me, but there was something in his gaze that felt different. When our eyes met across the room, there was an undeniable tension, a connection that felt just below the surface, pulling at both of us. And every time he glanced away, I couldn't help but wonder if he too was feeling the weight of it. I tried to focus on the guests around me, making polite conversation, but it was as if I was on autopilot. My thoughts kept drifting back to that moment, to the brief touch of his fingers against mine, to the way his smile had felt just a little too intimate, just a little too knowing. I looked up again and caught Jackson's gaze. For a brief second, it felt like he was looking straight into me, into the place where my confusion and curiosity collided, and then, as quickly as it had begun, he was swallowed by the crowd, lost to the sea of faces. It was like a flicker of something fleeting, like two people on the verge of a realization that neither of them was willing to acknowledge. And for the first time that night, I felt unsettled. Something was changing, and I wasn't sure if it was something I wanted to confront. "Hey, you okay?" I turned, startled, to find Emily from the marketing department standing next to me. She was smiling, her eyes bright, but there was a slight tilt of her head that suggested she could sense something was off. Emily had always been perceptive like that. "Yeah, just fine," I replied, offering a weak smile. "Just tired, I guess." She didn't seem convinced. "You sure? You're acting a little distant tonight." She raised an eyebrow, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "It's Jackson, isn't it?" I blinked, momentarily taken aback. "What?" Emily chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Come on, don't play coy with me. You've been glancing over at him all evening. We all know the way he can affect a room, but there's something different tonight. You two, it's like there's this tension. You can't hide it." I froze, unsure how to respond. Had it really been that obvious? Had Jackson and I been that transparent? I couldn't deny the pull between us, the way it had changed the air between us, but I didn't know if I was ready to confront it, let alone discuss it with someone else. I'm not sure what you mean," I said slowly, hoping my voice didn't betray the swirl of emotions threatening to surface. Emily's expression softened, but there was still a playful glint in her eyes. "I'm not saying anything's going on, but there's definitely something there. And honestly, if you're going to try to avoid it, good luck." She grinned before stepping back into the crowd, leaving me standing there, a little more exposed than before. I felt a rush of heat in my cheeks. Was it really that obvious? Had everyone noticed the strange connection between Jackson and me? The thought made me uncomfortable, but at the same time, it stirred something else in me. An unease, yes, but also a curiosity. As if on cue, I felt his eyes on me again. Jackson was standing near the entrance, deep in conversation with a few of the senior executives, but his gaze seemed to find me no matter where I stood. And this time, I didn't look away. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. His eyes locked with mine, and this time, it wasn't a fleeting glance. There was something in his expression that made my breath hitch, a quiet acknowledgement of whatever had passed between us earlier, something shared, but never spoken. The air between us thickened, and I suddenly felt like the room had narrowed down to just the two of us. It was a strange, electric feeling, one that made everything else seem distant and irrelevant. And just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it was gone. The conversation around Jackson picked up again, and he turned back to his colleagues, the crowd absorbing him once more. But I stood there, still reeling from the brief but undeniable connection that had passed between us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't help but feel that something important had just shifted, something that neither of us could pretend to ignore anymore. But what exactly was it? And where would it lead? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for sure. The night had just become far more complicated than I had ever anticipated. I needed a break from the noise, from the crowd. The laughter and chatter felt too overwhelming, so I quietly slipped away to the terrace, hoping for some peace. The cool night air greeted me as I leaned against the railing, gazing out at the city lights. I wasn't alone for long. Jackson appeared beside me, his presence almost unnoticed at first. He stood there for a moment before speaking. "Trying to escape, are we?" His voice was calm, but I could feel a hint of something deeper beneath the casual words. I gave a small shrug. "Just needed a moment?" He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant skyline. "These events, they're always a bit shallow, don't you think?" His tone was unexpected, quieter than I'd ever heard it. I glanced at him. "Shallow?" Jackson turned to me, his expression soft. "People pretend to enjoy themselves, but it's all just an act. Masks. No one's really being themselves." I paused, unsure how to respond. You don't like these events, then? He looked at me, his eyes a little different, more open than usual. But sometimes you have to play along. He paused, almost as if considering his own words. If you want to survive in a place like this. His words hung in the air, heavy with a truth I wasn't ready to face. The conversation felt too real, too personal, and in that moment I realized that whatever had passed between us earlier was only the beginning. Jackson's words lingered between us like a quiet hum that I couldn't shake off. There was something in the way he spoke, something raw beneath his usual polished exterior that left me feeling both exposed and oddly connected to him. The night felt different now, heavier, as if the space between us had shifted in ways neither of us were ready to confront. I didn't expect you to say that, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure what I expected, but it wasn't this quiet vulnerability, this rare honesty he had just shared. Jackson gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, but there was a sadness to it that I hadn't seen before. Yeah, well, he said, leaning slightly against the railing beside me. Sometimes you see things clearer when you step away from the chaos. You really think these events are just a way to hide? I asked, more curious than ever. Jackson's gaze drifted toward the horizon again. It's not just the parties, it's the whole game, the company, the industry, everything. People hide behind smiles, behind success, but no one's truly real. His voice dropped lower, almost to himself. We all play a part, because that's what's expected. We're not supposed to be real. I felt a strange rush of empathy for him. But you've made it. You're the one everyone looks up to, I said, unsure if I was trying to comfort him or myself. Jackson turned his eyes toward me, and in that moment there was an intensity in them that sent a chill down my spine. I've made it, yes, but I'm also not sure who I am anymore. Then, unexpectedly, Jackson spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. You know, you're different, not like the rest of them. I turned to him, caught off guard. What do you mean? He met my gaze with a steady, almost searching look. You don't play the game the way everyone else does. You're not hiding, not really. His words made my heart skip. I wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or exposed, but the truth was, there was something about Jackson that made me feel both seen and vulnerable in ways I wasn't used to. The tension between us was undeniable now. It wasn't just the words we exchanged, it was the way we seemed to understand something unspoken, something more than what either of us had bargained for. And as Jackson's eyes lingered on mine for just a moment longer, I realized we were both standing on the edge of something uncertain, something real. But where it would lead, I had no idea. The conversation had shifted something inside me, leaving me unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. Jackson's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about how different he seemed, how much more there was to him than the confident leader I knew at work. I was trying to gather my thoughts when Emily appeared again, this time with a mischievous grin. She leaned in, lowering her voice. You two, there's definitely something there. I felt my heart race. What do you mean? She shrugged casually, but her eyes twinkled. Come on, the way he looks at you, it's obvious. Before I could respond, she wandered off, leaving me to process her words. Was it really that obvious? The last thing I wanted was for people to notice whatever was happening between Jackson and me. Then, as if on cue, Jackson caught my gaze again. This time it wasn't just a glance. It was a knowing look. He wasn't hiding his interest anymore. I could feel it, that same pull between us, stronger than ever. The tension in the room seemed to magnify, and I could sense people watching, but in that moment all I could see was him. The air felt charged, like something was about to break wide open, but neither of us moved. We were caught in that space, where words weren't enough and neither of us knew what to do next. And then, suddenly, everything shifted again. Jackson turned away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, with the unmistakable feeling that whatever was happening between us had only just begun. The party wound down, and I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The awkward spill, the unexpected conversation with Jackson, the brief touches that felt far too intimate. Each moment had left an imprint on me, and I wasn't sure what to make of it all. Guests began to filter out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted. The way Jackson looked at me, the way he spoke to me, as if I was more than just an employee. It was all too much to ignore now. As the last few people left, Jackson approached me again. His expression was unreadable, his usual mask firmly in place. But there was something different in the way he looked at me, something more direct, as if he was waiting for something. "How do you feel about tonight?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated. "It was eventful," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, though I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. He smiled, but it was a quiet, knowing smile. "It was, wasn't it?" He took a step closer. "I noticed something in you tonight. There's potential. A lot more than you might realize." I felt a nervous flutter in my chest. Potential for what?